welcome to Sparta United Methodist Church. We thank you for joining us either by Facebook Live this morning or later on by YouTube. And thank you to Nancy for that wonderful prelude. There's not very many people here, but everyone that was, I saw a lot of toes tapping. That was a joyous way to start the day. Let's have our morning call to worship together. Christ is here, ready to be revealed. Watch and wait for the new growth that is coming. Listen for God, and God will speak. Seek the Spirit, and the Spirit will be revealed. For the Spirit is already here, inviting us to stay. Let's worship together this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Christ is here, and the new growth that Pastor Bill was talking about is out there in this all its beauty today. This is such a beautiful day, and we want you all to join in with us this morning as we sing Surely the Presence. Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. I can feel His mighty power and His grace. I can hear the rush of angels' wings. I see glory on His face. Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place.
We're going to have a time of prayer this morning. And one thing that I want to make sure to talk to you all about is the reason Pastor Bob isn't here this morning. He had to go to the hospital this week for a heart issue. He is stable, and he's being watched over very carefully. So we do ask that everyone in our Sparta United Methodist Church family and anyone that's listening to this, that you do keep Bob in your prayers as they do some tests this week to try to figure out what's going on. And we're just so thankful for the amazing care that he's receiving. Let's go before God in prayer this morning. Gracious God, we are so thankful for all the ways that you are at work in our lives, at work in this church, and at work in this community. We're thankful that we have stories to share of how your grace is moving and how people are experiencing your love. God, we ask for an extra pouring of your grace and healing on Pastor Bob today. We ask that you give his doctors wisdom. We ask that you watch over him and give him comfort. And God, most of all, we ask for healing so that he can be restored and healed and back here with us soon. God, we pray for our time in the Word today. God, may we learn to listen for your voice. May you speak through the scripture that we hear, through the songs that we sing, through the words of the message. And God, when we hear your voice, may we be moved to follow courageously into what you call us. We thank sin away. One sacrifice paid the price I could not pay. One holy Lamb, one great I am, one seed of Abraham. One holy Lamb, wash my sin away. Atonement paid, the Father Christ, the spotless Son of God must die. One final death for every man. One blood, one life, one holy Lamb. One holy Lamb, wash my sin away. One sacrifice paid the price I could not pay. One holy Lamb, one great I am, one seed of Abraham. One holy Lamb, wash my sin away. One holy Lamb, wash my sin away.
How blessed we are to have such amazing musical talent here at Spur United Methodist Church. Thank you all so much for sharing your gift with us. I'm going to be reading to us today from Luke chapter 24, beginning at verse 13 and going to 35. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only visitor in Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened there these days?" "What things?" Jesus asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and in all people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place." In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who had said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. But him they did not see. He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all the prophets had spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter in his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked to us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together, saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two who had happened on their way, they told what had happened on the way, and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
If I were to ask you what some of the greatest journeys in your life have been, I'd probably hear a variety of answers from you. Some of you might recall a road trip that you took, full of interesting stops and the joy of reaching an exciting destination. Some might talk about a time in your life where maybe you prepared for a race, or practiced for a performance, or prepared for an event where many people attended. Some stories of journeys are about struggles that we have in our lives. Struggles to find a job, maybe struggles to get pregnant or start a family, struggles to navigate school or relationships. Maybe if I asked you to share with us the story of a journey, you would tell us about how you endured a long journey with illness or cancer or addiction, how you made it through by the grace of God. Yes, I bet if I asked about the stories of the journeys in your life, there would be no shortage of what you could tell us. And that's because so few of the experiences in our life are neatly packaged one-time events. Most of life itself is a journey with detours, uphill climbs, mountaintop experiences, and dark valleys, and then plenty of common, ordinary days just traveling down life's road. So today, in our passage, we find ourselves on a journey with two of Jesus' followers as they travel from Jerusalem back to their home in Emmaus. You know, in the Gospel of Luke, where this story takes place, so much of life happens on the road. Jesus spends a good portion of the Gospel traveling on the road from Galilee to Jerusalem. The parables of the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son all have significant events that take place on the road. And now Jesus encounters two friends on the road who are wrestling with an incredibly difficult setback in their life. You see, in Luke's Gospel, these road trips are real events that happen, but they're also metaphors for life. They're also metaphors for our relationship with Jesus. We are on a journey with Jesus in this life, and our faith is the story of this journey. And this passage has much to tell us about how we can encounter God's grace in the midst of it all. I happen to think that the language of journey is really significant for the time that we find ourselves facing right now. I think if my count is correct, this is the 7th week of holding church online. The 7th week of our lives being turned upside down by this global pandemic. If you're like me, any sense of newness or novelty in this has pretty much worn off. And for many in our country and certainly around the world, there's been devastation and grief by this sickness and the loss of many loved ones. Maybe that's why when I read this passage this week, several words really jumped off the page to me. And that was this: but we had hoped. Doesn't that just kind of summarize life right now? But we had hoped that we'd all be together in the sanctuary by now. We had hoped for businesses to make it. And I think of our teenagers and children and teachers, especially the many that we used to spend so much time with throughout the week here at the church. There's been a lot of lost hopes for this school year. I think of our seniors that had hoped for all the joyful and unique events that would have happened this year. And now even the fall semester of their freshman year of college is looking like it might be impacted by this strange season of life. We had so many hopeful plans for ministry to our community this spring and summer that have had to be put on hold or modified. I think it's safe to say, even without this current crisis that's going on, so often the cry of our hearts is a cry of this loss of hope for loved ones who are sick, or marriages that are on the rocks, or family relationships that are strained to the breaking point. I think many of us can resonate with this statement, but we had hoped. These words uttered by Cleopas and his companion on the road were words of broken dreams and canceled hope. And it might surprise you to realize that this story actually takes place on the very first Easter day. And while Luke's first Easter story that we sometimes read on Easter morning is full of spectacular angels and empty tombs and acclamations that he is risen, this story begins with two disciples who thought Jesus was the hope they were looking for, the promised Messiah of Israel and the world, and then Jesus had them killed, so they packed up and went home. My friends, though, this is an Easter story. And if this is an Easter story, then that means even when you thought all hope was gone, hope is alive through Jesus like you've never seen before. I think that just like hope came alive for Cleopas and his friend in the midst of their journey, this story has a lot to tell us about how Jesus joins us in the journey of life, in the journey of faith. We know that the mysterious character that joins them on their journey is Jesus. And we see Jesus bring grace and hope flooding into their lives. And there's three ways he does that I'd like to talk about this morning. Jesus brings hope through his presence, through his word, and through food. I want to talk to you today about how Jesus comes to us in these three ways still today. Whatever your journey looks like right now, but especially if you are traveling down the road of life saying, but we had hoped. I've always loved the way that Jesus joins these two travelers and has a normal, everyday conversation with them. Jesus is present with them in the moment of their grief and frustration, and he listens to them. He listens to them talk and process what they're going through, even though he knows they don't have any reason to be worried or afraid anymore. I think that just like these disciples of Jesus, we can sometimes too struggle to imagine that Jesus is walking alongside us when we experience the difficulties and heartbreak in life. But this passage teaches us to look for Jesus in unexpected places. You may be wondering how these followers of Jesus didn't even know that he was walking alongside of them for several miles. How could they be so clueless? Some have wondered if Jesus maybe even disguised himself in some way. Personally, I think it's just really hard to see what you're not looking for. A video I watched a little while back on the internet kind of illustrated this. It had two teams of basketball players, one in light uniforms and one in dark uniforms. And each team ran in a really chaotic, tight pattern in a small circle. And each team was passing its own ball back and forth. The video then challenges you to count how many times one of the teams passes the ball. So I watched closely and intently, and I focused very hard, and I counted to 13. I was so proud of myself when a voice came over the video and said, "The correct answer is 13. And then it said, "But did you see the moonwalking bear?" What? Just to be sure, I went back and watched the video again from the start, and sure enough, in the midst of these teams passing the basketball back and forth, there is a man in a bear costume moonwalking and doing absurd dance moves, and I had never even noticed such an outlandish thing in the middle of the screen. Friends, if this story teaches us anything, it's that Jesus is so often in the midst of our normal and ordinary lives, sometimes right under our noses. But so often we aren't looking for him. We're counting basketball passes and keeping our eyes fixed on all the chaos of life. And this story shows us that if we're willing to look for Jesus, his presence in our life changes everything. I know that I've experienced some of this same presence of Jesus in my life. There's been many times where I've been frustrated, scared, lonely, helpless, afraid, lost. Times when my prayers don't sound very religious, and indeed maybe are very secular in tone. I can't explain it. I just know that when my prayers are just a conversation with Jesus about what I'm going through, Jesus is present with me in those moments. And I know that he's listening. And his presence in those moments brings healing and hope. These types of prayers can be normal, everyday conversations that you have with Jesus like you would with a friend. Because he's present with you on this journey. And you know, as followers of Jesus, we can offer that same ministry of healing to others. Maybe not in person right now, but through telephones and computers and letters and text messages, we can walk through life with people and offer that same healing hope that comes through listening. As someone that loves to read the Bible and study theology, I think I would give anything to be a part of that conversation where Jesus opened up the scriptures to these two friends and their hearts burned within them. But it is not only with us and this presence that Jesus speaks to us. I would say that you can experience Jesus' presence and hope in your life through many different ways. In a Zoom conversation with Hope Fellowship Church last week, I was so encouraged to hear all the ways people are hearing God's voice in their life right now. People shared how they've heard God's words of hope and wisdom as they are out in nature, as they watch the sunrise. They talked about how quiet moments of meditation and prayer are moments of insight and healing for them. How time with the Bible has allowed them to hear God's voice in fresh, new ways. This is a very important part of our journey, my friends. There is no prescription for how to listen and be filled with God's word other than to create that space in your life and to try and do it. I found in my own life and heard in the stories of others' life that when we hear God through God's word, it's usually connected to some way that God created us to be. So some of us connect to God best outside, some through reading, some through writing or journaling, others through art, all of us probably through some combination of a variety of ways. There are many ways that God has created us to pray and connect with God. And I just want to encourage you, in these days that can be so draining, boring, yet also strangely intense, take time to connect with God, because it will make all the difference. Did you notice when these two friends recognized that Jesus had been with them the whole time? It was when Jesus did the most Jesus-y thing that he could do. He sat down to a meal with them, he broke the bread, gave thanks, and gave it to them all. All throughout the Gospels, Jesus uses meals to connect with people, to invite the ones that others rejected into close and intimate community, and to give in abundance to those that were hungry and bring meaning and hope into people's lives. So much of what Jesus did revolved around food, and that makes sense because so much of our lives do too. In fact, a few verses later in this chapter in Luke, Jesus appears to his disciples in the upper room, standing before them, having defeated death and risen from the grave, and he says to them, "Do you all have anything to eat?" You see, God is present in the normal, everyday rhythms of life, like eating We know this because they recognized that it was Jesus when the guest became the host and created space for them to share life together. They recognized it was Jesus when he gave thanks to God for what they had before them. They recognized it was Jesus when he shared what he had with them at the table. It was these small things that Jesus did every day that caused them to see that God was with them in a powerful way in that moment. A way that set their hearts on fire. So, if we were living in normal circumstances right now, I would tell you that eating meals with others is such a wonderful way and simple way for us to live like Jesus and create space for people to experience God's love and abundance as we invite people into our church and into our lives and into our homes, offering them more than food, but offering hope. But that's not how life is right now, is it? We had hoped it might be different, but it's not. But do you know what? We live in an Easter story too. We live on the other side of the good news of Easter, and we know that Jesus is alive and present with us, working through us in new and wonderful ways if we choose to see it. You just might have to think outside the box a little bit. You might have to be willing to look for the dancing bear in the midst of the basketball game. You know, I don't think I'll ever forget the day 6 or 7 weeks ago when Pastor Bob, Ren, Kyla, and I sat over there in the Hope Fellowship room trying to figure out how to keep ministries like Grace Kitchen going with the restrictions that had just been placed on us. You know, the easy thing would have been to shut it down. Grace Kitchen has always been about feeding the body and feeding the soul. The conversations that people have around the table are crucial to experiencing God's loving presence in their lives. Could Grace Kitchen exist without that critical aspect of it? Well, as many of you know, we decided to change Grace Kitchen's model into a takeout-only style and began serving meals in brown paper bags to people in our parking lot. The video we put on Facebook explaining this was viewed thousands of times, which really shocked us. And each week we have seen more and more people come to get a hot meal, hygiene products, and even toilet paper. I think the reason for all of this is because it brings people hope. And we've received a lot of messages of people saying that this simple ministry of food and hygiene items brings hope into their lives. Now, I'm telling you that for 2 reasons. First is because I want to thank the many of you who have given to Grace Kitchen and supported us in many ways, both in this church and in this community, because it's made this incredible ministry possible, and we couldn't do it without you. But secondly, I'm telling you this story about Grace Kitchen because I want to encourage you that this is a time to think creatively, to think outside the box, to prayerfully go before God and ask for wisdom in how you can still share the good news and hope and love of Jesus with others in this difficult time. No matter how small you feel like maybe your life has become, no matter how different things are from the way they used to be, even if you feel frustrated and bored, the good news of this story is that even the smallest details, the smallest rhythms of our lives matter. This story reminds us that fountains of living water still spring alive within you. There are still many ways that we can see Jesus present and at work in your life as you are filled with Jesus' word and share it with others. Friends, this means that Jesus is present in the text messages that you send to your friends. It means that Jesus is there in a special way in the phone calls you make to the people that God puts on your minds and hearts. It means that Jesus is there when you smile beneath your mask to the person working long hours at the grocery store. It means that God's divine presence is at work when you struggle through another intense homebound day with your children. It means God's grace is at work in your life when you endure the frustrating learning curve of some new technology just to connect with people. Friends, wherever we make room for Jesus in our lives, Jesus comes to us. And Jesus is at work within us. If we let him, Jesus takes these small things and blesses them and transforms them into powerful experiences of God's love and God's grace. So keep it up. God will give you the strength for this journey. The Holy Spirit will fill you with God's wisdom as you love others and walk in his path. And Jesus himself will be with you every day and every step of this journey.
As Pastor Ben talked about the Easter story and how it continues, there's victory over death, victory over sin, and our hymn this morning is going to be Victory in Jesus. You all know it. Please join us. We want to hear you from inside the sanctuary.
His
is with us. Go in God's grace and peace to share this good news with the world. We'll see you next week.
To